Can a single act of racist humiliation ever truly be forgotten? Or does karma, or perhaps a deeper form of justice, possess an inescapable way of finding its target, sometimes emerging from the most unexpected corners of the world? Are we bound by the desire for revenge, or can we find a path to something more enduring? What would you choose? Forgiveness in the face of casual cruelty, or a quiet, measured retribution delivered by the scales of consequence? Prepare yourself for the story of Nathaniel Brooks, a man whose patience was as deep as his gaze, a man whose quiet presence carried a weight capable of shifting the very foundations of a system that seemed utterly immovable. This is not a tale of a sudden explosion, but of a slow, inevitable turning of tides, beginning with a moment of profound disrespect witnessed in a place meant for reverence. The late October rain whispered against the tall, arched windows of the courthouse, casting a gray, somber light upon the polished floors within. Outside, the world was being washed clean, but inside these hallowed halls, a different kind of grime lingered, unseen by most. This was a place where justice was dispensed. Yet sometimes, the deepest injustices unfolded in the most ordinary of moments, in the very corridors meant to symbolize impartiality and law. Nathaniel Brooks, a black man somewhere in the latter half of his 50s, moved with a quiet, focused intent. His face, etched with lines that spoke of long days and a life lived with perhaps more than its share of hardship, held a calm, almost serene expression. He wore the standard-issue uniform of a courthouse custodian, a garment faded and softened by countless washes and the passage of time. It hung slightly loose on his frame, a testament to years of physical labor. In his hands, he held a well-used mop and a bucket of water. His movements were methodical, deliberate. He wasn't just wiping the floor. He was attending to it, cleaning each section with meticulous care, as if the very dignity of the space depended on the thoroughness of his effort. His eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed distant, lost in thought, or perhaps simply focused entirely on the task at hand, on the small, manageable world immediately before him. The hushed reverence of the courthouse was suddenly shattered by a burst of loud laughter and confident voices echoing down the corridor. A group of police officers strode into view, their movements crisp, their uniforms sharp, a stark contrast to Nathaniel's worn attire. They walked with an air of authority, chests puffed out slightly, chins held high, a collective presence that seemed to command the space around them. Leading the group was Officer Rick Halden, a white man, likely in his early 40s, with sharp, angular features and eyes that held a perpetually cold, dismissive glint. He exuded an almost palpable sense of entitlement, a comfortable arrogance that came from years of wearing the badge and inhabiting a position of power. Halden paused as he reached Nathaniel, stopping directly in the custodian's path. He looked down at Nathaniel, a slow, cruel smirk spreading across his face. His gaze swept over the worn uniform, the mop, and finally landed on Nathaniel's face. His voice was loud, deliberately so, pitched to carry down the hallway and ensure his companions heard his jibe. "Well, looky here," Halden boomed, his voice dripping with derision. "Thought your generation was supposed to be free by now? Guess some folks still gotta scrub the toilets for me." A ripple of laughter, loud and harsh, erupted from the officers behind Halden. It was a sound designed to humiliate, to reduce the man before them to a stereotype, to reinforce the invisible lines of power and perceived superiority. The sound bounced off the polished walls, magnifying its cruelty in the otherwise quiet building. Nathaniel did not flinch. He did not drop his mop or cry out in protest. For a brief moment, he simply froze, his movement suspended. Then, very slowly, he straightened his back just a fraction, lifting his head. His dark eyes met Rick Halden's gaze directly. There was no flicker of rage in Nathaniel's eyes, no spark of immediate anger or defensiveness. Nor was there the defeated, downcast look one might expect. Instead, his eyes held a deep, quiet knowing. It was a look that seemed to see through Halden, through the uniform, through the casual cruelty, to something else entirely. It was a look of profound understanding, not of why Halden would say such a thing, but understanding of the type of man who would say it. It was almost as if Nathaniel had anticipated this moment, or perhaps had lived through countless similar moments before. A subtle, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of Nathaniel's lips. It wasn't a happy smile, or an amused one. It was something far more complex, perhaps a touch of sadness, a hint of weary acceptance, or even a silent, internal acknowledgement of a truth that Halden was completely oblivious to. It was a smile that held no malice, but immense depth. He held Rick Halden's gaze for just a few seconds, a silent exchange passing between them that the other officers completely missed. Then, without a word, Nathaniel slowly lowered his head and resumed his cleaning. His movements remained deliberate, focused. He continued to wipe the floor, meticulously attending to the task, as if the interruption had merely been a brief, unpleasant gust of wind that had now passed. The group of officers, still chuckling, continued down the hall, their footsteps echoing away. They left behind only the lingering scent of disinfectant and the quiet, persistent sound of the mop against the stone floor. Later that night, the rain had settled into a steady drizzle, casting a sheen on the empty streets. At a deserted bus stop, under the weak glow of a single, flickering light, sat Nathaniel Brooks, alone. The contrast with the bustling courthouse earlier in the day, the stark isolation of this moment, was palpable. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a folded, slightly crumpled file. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft and worn. He opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the words. His name stood out clearly, Nathaniel Brooks. Below it, an official stamp, the seal of a police academy. He turned the page, revealing an old photograph. The colors were faded, the image slightly blurry, but the scene was clear. It was a family photograph. A man stood tall, wearing a police uniform, his posture proud, his face kind and full of love. Next to him, held loosely in his arm, was a young boy, a child with bright, hopeful eyes and a wide, uninhibited smile. The uniform was a generation old, the faces younger, full of a future yet to be lived. Nathaniel looked from the photograph, from the image of that hopeful child and his uniformed father, back to the text on the file, the academy stamp, the confirmation of a path once taken. Then his gaze drifted out, past the bus stop shelter, into the falling rain, into the darkness of the night. His face was unreadable, a canvas of quiet contemplation. The man who cleaned the floors of the courthouse, the target of casual, racist scorn, carried within him a history, a connection to the very institution he served from its lowest rung. His story, it was clear, was far from being fully told. The janitor was not merely a janitor. 1 week, 7 days had drifted by since the brief, sharp encounter in the echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. For Nathaniel Brooks, that week had likely been one of preparation, a quiet assembling of intent and purpose. For Rick Halden, it had probably been just another typical week, the memory of the janitor's face already fading into the background noise of a busy life, a minor, quickly forgotten moment of self-satisfied superiority. But time has a way of resetting the stage, and sometimes the seemingly insignificant encounters are merely prologues to profound shifts. The ordinary hum of the precinct was about to be silenced, replaced by a different, more resonant frequency. There was an undeniable current running through the police station that morning, a ripple of unease that had smoothed out the usual boisterous edges of the place. Officers moved with a little less swagger, spoke in slightly hushed tones, and their eyes seemed to linger a moment too long on the administrative corridor. Something significant was afoot, something that had everyone on edge, polishing their badges just a little brighter, straightening their ties with undue care. What could possibly command such universal, nervous attention from the typically confident men and women of the force? The answer for Officer Rick Halden was about to arrive with quiet, devastating precision. Storytelling. Rick Halden pushed open the glass doors of the precinct precisely on time, the familiar jingle of the small bell overhead a comforting sound. He carried his customary large coffee cup, its warmth seeping through the cardboard, a ritualistic start to his day. The main floor stretched out before him, rows of desks, computer monitors flickering to life, the scent of stale coffee and worn carpet. This was his territory, the place where he spent the majority of his waking hours, the backdrop to his career. He expected the usual morning greetings, the exchange of tired jokes, the gradual crescendo of activity as the day began in earnest. But the usual morning tableau was conspicuously absent. Instead of the familiar buzz, there was a low, almost reverent quiet. Officers were at their desks, yes, but they were seated stiffly, their shoulders held tight. Conversations were brief, delivered in hushed voices, punctuated by nervous glances towards the inner offices. A few officers stood by the coffee machine, not talking, just staring into their cups. The collective posture of the room was one of waiting, of braced anticipation. Rick paused, his hand still on the door handle, a frown knitting his brow. This wasn't right. This wasn't how the precinct woke up. "All right, what's going on?" he called out, his voice perhaps a little louder than intended in the unaccustomed silence. A few heads turned, but the expressions were tight-lipped, unrevealing. No one offered a glib answer or a sarcastic remark, just tight, anxious looks. He shrugged internally, deciding it was probably some bureaucratic shake-up or a mandatory training announcement that had everyone in a collective funk. He started walking towards his desk, taking a slow sip of his coffee, trying to project an air of unaffected normalcy. As his eyes casually swept across the large bulletin board mounted on the wall near the briefing room, a new addition caught his attention. Centered on the board, replacing the usual clutter of notices, was a single, professionally framed portrait. Below it, block letters, stark against the white background, read, "New Chief Inspector." Rick stopped walking. The coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. His breath hitched. His gaze locked onto the face in the photograph. The casual confidence drained from his features, replaced by a look of utter, unadulterated shock. It was the face of the man from the courthouse hallway, the custodian, Nathaniel Brooks. His hand began to tremble, and the coffee sloshed precariously close to spilling over the rim. The absurdity of it, the sheer impossibility, made his mind reel. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate, sick joke. The man he had verbally spat upon, the man he had seen on his knees with a mop, was looking out from a photograph identifying him as the chief inspector. No way. The words were barely a whisper, a ragged sound torn from his throat, drowned out by the sudden, deafening rush of blood in his own ears. Just at that moment, as the full, disorienting impact of the photograph struck him, the heavy oak door of the main administrative office suite swung open. All heads, which had momentarily turned towards Rick's whispered disbelief, snapped back to the doorway. A figure emerged. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, perfectly tailored suit that spoke of expense and authority. His shirt was crisp, his tie understated but elegant. His posture was upright, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked with a quiet confidence, a presence that seemed to fill the space effortlessly. His face, once lined with the fatigue of physical labor, now held a look of sharp intelligence and cool, unyielding determination. The man who entered the room bore little resemblance to the man who had been scrubbing floors a week ago, yet the identity was unmistakable. It was Nathaniel Brooks. He paused just inside the doorway, allowing his presence to register. He scanned the room slowly, his dark eyes meeting the gazes of the officers lined up, standing stiffly. There was no warmth in his expression, no small talk, just a focused, assessing look. He acknowledged their collective tension with a silent, unreadable acknowledgement. His eyes continued their sweep across the room, methodically taking in each face, each posture. And then his gaze found Rick Halden. Rick was still standing near the bulletin board, transfixed, the coffee cup forgotten in his hand. Nathaniel's eyes settled on him. For a long moment, time seemed to slow. In Nathaniel's gaze, there was still that same deep, quiet knowing that Rick had briefly seen in the courthouse. It wasn't triumphant or angry. It was simply present. A silent recognition across the vast, newly created chasm between them. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice resonating clearly through the silent precinct. It was a voice that commanded attention, calm yet carrying immense weight. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his tone professional and direct. "I am Chief Inspector Nathaniel Brooks." He paused, letting the title hang in the air, allowing its significance to fully land. "As of today," he continued, his voice gathering subtle intensity, "I have assumed command as the new Chief Inspector of this precinct. My mandate is to oversee all operational aspects, ensure adherence to procedure, and uphold the highest standards of professional conduct and ethical practice." His gaze remained fixed on Rick Halden as he delivered the next lines, making the target of his focus explicitly clear. "This oversight," Nathaniel stated, his voice firm and leaving no room for misinterpretation, "will be comprehensive. It will involve a thorough review of existing cases, ongoing investigations, and officer conduct records. And yes," he finished, his voice dropping slightly but gaining immense power, "Officer Halden, that includes the direct oversight and review of your work and your history within this department, effective immediately." The moment of truth had arrived. The man Rick Halden had publicly ridiculed as a mere cleaner was now his direct superior, holding the highest non-elected position in the precinct. The transformation in Nathaniel, from the humble custodian to the authoritative chief inspector, was not just one of attire, but of presence and power. This was more than just a change of boss. It was a complete and utter reversal of fortunes, a seismic shift in the established hierarchy, orchestrated by the very person Rick had believed was beneath him. Rick's world, built on a foundation of casual superiority and entrenched position, had just been irrevocably shaken by the quiet return of a man he had utterly failed to see. The seed of the plot twist planted in Act I had blossomed into the central conflict of Act II. The shock of Nathaniel Brooks's arrival quickly morphed into a gnawing, inescapable dread for Rick Halden. It rapidly became apparent that the new chief inspector's focus on oversight was anything but general. It felt surgical, deliberate, and increasingly aimed directly at the complex, often murky history of Rick's career. This wasn't just a change in management. It was the meticulous, step-by-step dismantling of a career built on questionable foundations. Storytelling. The days that followed Chief Inspector Brooks's arrival were a living hell for Rick Halden. The initial shock wore off, replaced by a constant, simmering anxiety. Nathaniel Brooks did not waste time. He didn't grandstand or make sweeping public declarations. His work was quiet, methodical, and deeply intrusive into the established routines and histories of the precinct. Requests for case files began almost immediately. Not recent cases, but older ones, closed investigations, cases that Rick Halden had considered finished and buried years ago. The paperwork flowed into the chief inspector's new office, thick folders, evidence logs, interview transcripts, arrest reports, and a disproportionate number of these requests bore the name Rick Halden on the original forms. Nathaniel Brooks, working late behind his closed door, seemed to possess an almost uncanny eye for detail. He didn't rely on accusations. He relied on paper, on procedure, on the cold, hard facts documented in the official record. Questions began to filter back out, directed to the original officers involved, but most pointedly to Rick. Officer Halden, please provide the original, unaltered recording of the interview with Ms. Rodriguez in the Ramirez assault case. Our copy seems to have a significant gap. Regarding the evidence log for the Daniels robbery investigation, there is an entry for a recovered weapon, but no corresponding chain of custody form after its initial collection. Can you explain this discrepancy? Several witness statements in the Foster drug bust indicate conflicting accounts regarding the time of your arrival on the scene. Please reconcile these discrepancies with your official report. Each query was like the precise tap of a geologist's hammer, chipping away at the layers of rock, revealing the softer, more vulnerable material beneath. The muck that Nathaniel had spoken of in Act I wasn't just the physical dirt he cleaned. It was the moral and procedural filth that had accumulated within the system, hidden away in dusty files and forgotten reports. And Nathaniel, the former janitor, was now meticulously cleaning it up. The atmosphere in the precinct curdled. Officers who had laughed with Rick, who had socialized with him, now avoided his gaze. Conversations stopped when he approached. Whispers followed him down hallways. He felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their silence. He was no longer one of them. He was the target, the source of the unprecedented internal scrutiny that was disrupting everyone's comfort. His isolation was profound, amplifying his growing fear. He saw Nathaniel Brooks frequently, walking the halls with a quiet authority, sitting in meetings with an attentive, analytical expression, always working, always focused. Rick searched for any sign of personal animosity, any hint of a smirk or a triumphant glance, but found none. Nathaniel's expression remained coolly professional. His demeanor focused solely on the task of reviewing, questioning, and exposing. And that clinical detachment was almost more terrifying than open hostility. It confirmed that this wasn't about a personal grudge. It was about his documented failures and alleged corruption being systematically brought to light. The pressure became unbearable. The mounting evidence, the cold efficiency of Nathaniel's investigation, the palpable shift in how his colleagues treated him, it all culminated in a desperate, cornered reaction. Rick had to make Nathaniel see this was personal, that it stemmed from that day. He had to force a reaction, a confession of revenge, to give himself something, anything to push back against. He found Nathaniel in his office late one afternoon. The door was slightly ajar. Rick didn't knock. He shoved it open fully and stormed in, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and panic. Rick stood panting just inside the doorway, his eyes wild, scanning the room as if looking for a hidden weapon or a secret camera. He focused on Nathaniel, who was seated at his large desk, calmly reading a file. "You're doing this deliberately," Rick accused, his voice loud and trembling with emotion. "This is all because of that day, isn't it? In the courthouse. You remember. You heard me. You saw me. And now you're finally getting your revenge. Admit it." His hands were clenched tightly at his sides, his body rigid with tension. He leaned forward, his gaze challenging, demanding a confession of personal vendetta. Nathaniel slowly closed the file he was reading and placed it on his desk. He raised his head and looked directly at Rick. His expression was calm, measured, devoid of the anger Rick was trying to provoke. "Officer Halden," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet but firm, possessing a stillness that contrasted sharply with Rick's agitation. "I remember that day, yes, but you misunderstand its significance. That moment, while regrettable, was merely a symptom of a larger problem. The problem isn't my personal feelings about your words. The problem is your documented conduct as an officer of the law." He held Rick's intense gaze. "My purpose here is not to settle a personal score for an insult delivered in a hallway. My purpose is to ensure the integrity of this department, to review the cases where procedure may have been violated, where justice may have been denied. The inconsistencies, the missing evidence, the questionable reports, these are not things I fabricated to target you. These are things I am finding in the official record of your work." Nathaniel's voice remained level, factual. "If the consequences of your professional actions, actions that appear to violate the trust placed in you as an officer, feel like revenge to you, then perhaps you should examine the nature of those actions. The system is not bending to my personal will, Officer Halden. It is simply being allowed to function as it was designed to, by exposing what was hidden." He concluded, his voice carrying the weight of unassailable truth. "I am not your enemy because of an insult. I am here because the record suggests your actions have made you an enemy of the principles this badge is supposed to represent." This confrontation served to solidify the narrative's core theme. Nathaniel's actions were driven by a commitment to systemic justice rather than personal vengeance. Rick's desperate attempt to reduce the situation to a petty personal feud failed, highlighting his inability to grasp the true gravity of his professional misconduct. Nathaniel's calm, logical response, grounded in the evidence of Rick's own work, definitively framed the ongoing investigation not as retribution for a past slight, but as the necessary consequence of past corruption being brought into the light. Rick was left isolated and facing the undeniable reality of the reckoning initiated by the man he had so callously underestimated. The stage was set for the inevitable fall. The meticulous work of Chief Inspector Nathaniel Brooks continued, a quiet storm moving through the precinct. Each file reviewed, each discrepancy noted, each question asked, sent ripples through the department, but the most significant waves crashed directly upon the shores of Officer Rick Halden's life. The foundation of his career, built on years of cutting corners and leveraging his position, was being systematically eroded, not by an act of vengeance, but by the simple, unyielding application of procedure and truth. The system, once a shield for his misconduct, was now turning its gaze upon him, guided by the steady hand of the man he had once mocked. The wheels of justice, once seemingly stalled or diverted for certain individuals, had begun to turn with an undeniable momentum. And this time they were grinding towards those who had believed themselves untouchable, including the man whose arrogance had set this entire chain of events in motion. Rick Halden's carefully constructed world was crumbling piece by piece under the weight of his own past actions. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, not by an enemy, but by the very rules he swore to uphold? The internal investigation into Rick Halden's conduct escalated rapidly. What started as a review of specific cases quickly broadened into a comprehensive audit of his entire career within the precinct. Investigators, overseen by Chief Inspector Brooks, meticulously followed the threads of evidence that Nathaniel had uncovered. Missing reports weren't just noted. Their absence was questioned and pursued. Witnesses who had been intimidated or coerced years ago were cautiously re-interviewed, their original, truthful accounts slowly surfacing. The dam of silence and complicity that had protected Rick for so long began to crack under the sustained pressure. The news, always hungry for scandal, caught wind of the internal turmoil. Anonymous leaks, perhaps from within the precinct itself, officers who had long resented Rick's impunity, or simply feared being caught in the fallout, painted a damning picture. Headlines screamed about corruption in the ranks, officer misconduct exposed, and internal affairs probe targets veteran cop. Rick's name, once associated with a certain tough guy image, was now dragged through the mud of public scrutiny. The media camped outside the precinct, thrusting microphones and cameras at officers entering and leaving. Rick couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of their gaze, the speculative whispers, the flash of a camera. His face, once confident and dismissive, was now captured in unflattering angles, etched with worry and defensiveness. The pressure didn't stop at the precinct doors. Followed him home. His wife, who had perhaps turned a blind eye to certain aspects of his job for years, was now confronted with the stark public reality of the accusations. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a place of tension and hushed arguments. His children, old enough to understand the news reports and the whispers at school, looked at him with confused, worried eyes. The pride they might have once felt in their father's profession was replaced by shame and uncertainty. Rick saw the strain on his family and felt a new, sharper pang of guilt, a consequence far more painful than any professional reprimand. Within the precinct, his isolation was complete. Officers actively avoided him. His usual lunch companions found sudden, urgent tasks elsewhere. The locker room conversations fell silent when he entered. He was a pariah, a liability, a walking embodiment of the trouble that had descended upon their workplace. He was no longer Rick Halden, the confident officer. He was Rick Halden, the subject of the investigation, the potential fall guy. The camaraderie, the unspoken bonds of the force, dissolved, leaving him utterly alone. He spent hours alone in his car, parked in quiet, out-of-the-way places, just watching the world go by. The once familiar streets of the city he was sworn to protect now felt alien, judgmental. He looked in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of his own reflection. The man staring back was a stranger. The swagger was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and haunted eyes. The sharp lines of his face seemed softer, blurred by exhaustion and regret. He saw not the powerful officer he thought he was, but a man cornered, stripped bare, facing the consequences of years of accumulated moral debt. The image in the mirror was a stark, undeniable reflection of his internal decay. The weight of it all became unbearable. The public shame, the strain on his family, the complete abandonment by his colleagues, and the irrefutable evidence mounting against him, it crushed his resistance. The anger he had felt towards Nathaniel Brooks dissipated, replaced by a hollow emptiness and a dawning, painful realization of the magnitude of his own actions. There was nothing left to fight for, nowhere left to hide. The only path left was the one he had always avoided, facing the truth and facing the man who had brought it to light. One evening, long after the main precinct had emptied, Rick found himself standing outside Chief Inspector Brooks's office door. The light was still on inside. He hesitated for a long moment, his hand hovering uncertainly. The arrogance that had propelled him through his career was utterly gone, replaced by a profound sense of humility and dread. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open gently. Nathaniel Brooks was sitting at his large desk, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp, reviewing documents. He looked up as Rick entered, his expression calm and unreadable. He didn't seem surprised. Rick stood just inside the doorway, unable to move further. His usual sharp features were softened by exhaustion and a raw vulnerability. His eyes, usually hard and cold, were clouded with unshed tears. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper, rough and broken, thick with emotion. "Chief Inspector Brooks," he began, his voice catching in his throat. He had to swallow hard before he could continue. I just wanted to say." He trailed off, struggling to find the words, the sheer weight of his regret pressing down on him. He looked at Nathaniel, the man he had so casually humiliated, the man who now held his fate in his hands. "I'm sorry," Rick finally managed, the words a ragged confession. "I'm so sorry for that day in the courthouse, and for everything else, for all of it." His voice cracked, and he had to stop, squeezing his eyes shut for a moment. "For all the times I wasn't who I should have been, for all the people I hurt or failed." He opened his eyes and looked at Nathaniel again, a plea for understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, in his gaze. "I know it doesn't make up for anything, but I needed you to know. I'm sorry." Nathaniel remained seated, his expression thoughtful. He didn't immediately respond, allowing Rick's words, and the raw emotion behind them, to settle in the quiet office. He studied Rick's face, not with judgment, but with a quiet, assessing gaze, as if measuring the sincerity of the apology. Finally, Nathaniel spoke, his voice low and steady, devoid of triumph or bitterness. "Officer Halden," he said, using Rick's title perhaps for the last time, "your apology is noted." He paused, then continued, his voice gaining a quiet strength that underscored the depth of his perspective. "But I don't need your apology for myself, Rick. That day in the hallway, it was unpleasant, yes. It was a moment of casual cruelty. But it was just one moment. And it was a symptom of a much deeper issue, wasn't it?" Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your apology," he continued, his gaze steady, "doesn't erase the years of questionable conduct documented in these files. It doesn't mend the lives that may have been negatively impacted by your actions or inactions as an officer. It doesn't restore faith in the system for those who lost it because of people like you." He looked at Rick with an intensity that wasn't accusatory, but deeply serious. I don't need you to be sorry for me. I need you to understand why you are sorry. I need you to understand the systemic impact of your choices. I need you to change, Rick. Not just say the words because you're facing consequences. I need you to change because it is the right thing to do. Because there are countless other people, young officers just starting out, members of the community who interact with law enforcement every day, who will come after me. And they deserve a system that is just equitable and free from the kind of actions that led you here. Nathaniel's voice softened slightly, but the weight of his words did not lessen. Your apology is a start, perhaps. But the real work, the real change, that is something you have to do for yourself and for all those others. Not for me. The story of Nathaniel Brooks and Rick Halden offers a powerful, nuanced perspective on justice and consequence. It teaches us that true accountability doesn't always arrive with a bang of anger or a violent act of revenge. Sometimes the most potent form of justice is quiet, methodical, and rooted in the unwavering pursuit of truth and the proper functioning of a system designed, ideally, to be fair. It is the act of using integrity and earned authority to meticulously clean up the rot, to bring things back into alignment, to ensure that the rules apply equally to all. And perhaps the most profound lesson is found in the aftermath of Rick Halden's fall. The final scene shows Rick, no longer wearing the uniform of authority, stripped of the power and arrogance that once defined him, standing in a room filled with young police cadets. He is not there as an instructor in police procedure, but as a guest speaker in a mandatory training session on racial bias and ethical conduct. He stands before them, a living, breathing cautionary tale. He recounts his own story, speaking of the casual prejudices he held, the corners he cut, the people he dismissed, and the devastating consequences that ultimately brought his career crashing down. His voice is no longer filled with bluster, but with a raw, honest vulnerability. He is a testament to the fact that justice can indeed come full circle, and that change, though perhaps forced and painful, is possible. He is not presented as a hero, but as a man learning publicly and painfully from his mistakes, offering his own failure as a lesson to others. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Chief Inspector Nathaniel Brooks walks out of the precinct building at the end of another day. The sun is beginning to set, casting long shadows. As he reaches the bottom of the steps, he sees a young black boy playing on the sidewalk nearby, chasing a ball, his laughter light and carefree. The boy plays without fear, without looking over his shoulder at the imposing building or the figure emerging from it. Nathaniel pauses for a moment, watching the child. A subtle smile touches his lips, not the complex, knowing smile from the courthouse hallway, but a smile of quiet satisfaction. It is the smile of a man who knows he has, in his own way, contributed to creating a world where this child might feel a little safer, a little more seen, a little more free to simply play. Nathaniel continues his walk, his steps steady and purposeful. He moves forward, not burdened by the past, but carrying the weight of experience and the quiet strength of a man who used his own journey through adversity to bring about meaningful change. He is the embodiment of the message that sometimes the people who are overlooked, the people who are pushed down, are the very ones who possess the resilience and the moral clarity needed to clean up the real dirt, not the grime on the floor, but the corruption and prejudice that can fester within institutions and within hearts. His quiet departure is not an ending, but a continuation of his work, a legacy built not on rank, but on integrity and the pursuit of a more just world. The journey of Nathaniel Brooks and Rick Halden is a powerful reminder of the importance of integrity, the long reach of consequences, and the potential for transformation even after failure. If this story resonated with you, If it made you think about the nature of justice, prejudice, and personal responsibility, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you learn from Nathaniel's actions? What did you feel watching Rick's downfall and his path towards redemption? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our future stories that explore the complexities of the human experience and the enduring pursuit of a better world. Thank you for watching.